The summer of 1838 arrived in Natchez with a kind of suffocating beauty. The heat did not shimmer, it pressed. It sat heavy on the magnolia leaves and thickened the air into a syrup that stuck to the lungs. The hills above the Mississippi were dusted in gold where the plantations stood, and the grandest among them belonged to Elias Beaumont, a man whose wealth had been built not on cotton alone, but on flesh. His house, Belchene, stood upon red clay bluffs overlooking the river, its columns pale as bone, its windows like dark eyes that never blinked. Inside that house lived his wife, Eveline Beaumont, a woman whose life was more silence than breath. She was 28 that summer, though she carried herself as if she had already lived too long. The servants whispered that she had once been beautiful before her first stillborn child, before the quiet madness that sometimes took her when the nights grew too humid to sleep. Her skin had the pallor of candle wax, her hair the luster of old gold, and her eyes, grey, unblinking, seemed always to be watching something that wasn't there. Belchene had been built over what had once been a river path, a long, buried channel of the Mississippi that had dried in an old flood. The old people said you could still hear water moving deep beneath the house in the quietest hours when everyone slept and only the whippoorwills kept watch. It was Eveline who heard it most, the faint whispering current beneath the floorboards, sighing through the night like a ghost remembering its own drowning. Her husband heard nothing. Elias Beaumont was a man of commerce and cruelty, broad in frame, narrow in soul. He spent his days along the wharf, inspecting new shipments from New Orleans, bargaining, buying, selling, men, women, children. He came home smelling of salt, sweat, and foreign perfume. At night he slept heavily beside her, snoring through the heat, while she lay awake listening to the phantom river murmur beneath the wood. It began one August evening when the light broke strange, orange and bleeding wide across the fields. Eveline had gone walking alone toward the slave quarters, her wide skirts brushing the grass, her parasol casting a ghostly oval of shade around her face. She moved like a sleepwalker through her own property, half aware of the people who stopped their work to watch her. The women bowed their heads. The men averted their eyes. The children froze. Eveline rarely came down there. Her husband did not allow it. But that evening she said she wanted to see the new arrivals from the coast. There were 5 of them, men, thin from the voyage, their backs marked with new scars. They stood beneath the cypress trees behind the smokehouse, the setting sun striping them in shadow. Eveline looked at them the way one might look at figures in a painting, detached, searching for meaning. But her gaze lingered too long on one. He was taller than the rest, his skin the color of oiled wood, his eyes a deep and defiant black that seemed almost luminous in the dying light. When he met her gaze, something inside her faltered. Not fear, not desire. Something deeper, a recognition. She turned away before her husband could notice. But that night, as she lay awake listening to the whisper of the hidden river, she could still see those eyes. And in the soft murmur beneath the floorboards, she thought she heard his voice, low, steady, almost prayerful, though she could not remember what he had said, or if he had spoken at all. Days passed. The house remained heavy with heat and the scent of dying flowers. The guests came and went, planters, traders, and preachers, all speaking of prophet and providence in the same breath. Eveline moved among them like a ghost dressed in ivory. She poured the wine, smiled when spoken to, and drifted again into the silence of her room. From her window she could see the men laboring in the fields. She could not name the reason, but her eyes always found him, the one she had looked at too long that evening. The one who never looked back again. As if to spare her, she did not know his name until she overheard her husband say it one morning, Samuel. That name began to echo in her thoughts. Samuel, like a hymn hummed under breath. She found herself writing it without meaning to, in the condensation on her window pane, in the dust of her vanity. She would wipe it away in shame, yet feel its ghost still there beneath her fingertips. When Elias left on business to New Orleans that month, the house emptied of its usual noise. The overseer rode the grounds with authority, but Eveline found herself free to wander again, down to the smokehouse, to the quarters, to the edge of the fields where the cypress roots reached like drowned fingers from the soil. She told herself she was only bringing food or clean linen. Charity, she thought. Mercy. But that night, when she heard the buried river moving beneath her bed, she felt it pulse like a heartbeat. She could no longer tell if the sound came from beneath the floor or within her chest. She began to dream, or thought she did, of water rising up the stairs, seeping under the door, lapping at her skirts. The sound of breathing in the dark, warm and slow. Each time she woke, the sheets were damp, her pulse unsteady. The scent of earth and river mud clung to her skin. By the end of that month, Eveline had come to believe that the house itself was sick, that something beneath it breathed. And in that sickness, she found reflection. One evening, she took a lantern and went down alone to the cellar. The air was thick, the boards sweating from humidity. She followed the sound, that whisper of hidden water, until she found the old storm drain at the back, sealed decades ago with bricks. The mortar had begun to crumble, and from between the cracks seeped a thin line of moisture, like sweat from a wound. When she touched it, it was warm. She pressed her ear against the wall and thought she heard something beneath it, not words, but rhythm, like the muffled beating of a drum, or a pulse. And then, faintly, a voice. She could not understand it, but she felt it. When she turned from the wall, she saw that her lantern light had found the outline of a figure standing at the top of the steps. A man, still as carved wood, Samuel. The lantern flame flickered as if bowing to him. Neither of them moved. For a moment, Eveline thought she might faint or fall to her knees. She did neither. She only watched him, unable to breathe. He did not speak. He simply looked at her. And then slowly he turned and disappeared back into the dark above. The next morning, she could not say if it had truly happened. She told herself it was delirium. The heat, the loneliness. Yet when she returned to her room, she found mud on the hem of her nightdress, and beneath her bed, a single dark fingerprint pressed into the wood. She began to wither after that. The servants whispered about her again. The way her appetite waned, the way she sat by the window for hours, her eyes lost somewhere in the distance. She refused company. She refused confession, and at night the river whispered louder. By the time Elias returned, the house had changed. The curtains never opened. The candles burned until their wax bled down the walls. He remarked that Eveline looked unwell, but he did not care enough to ask why. He only wanted his dinner hot, his bed warm, and his business resumed. That night, as she lay beside him, she could not stop hearing the breathing beneath the floorboards, heavier now, like a man lying just under the house. Whispering through the cracks, Elias turned in his sleep, mumbling through the heat. And she realized suddenly that his breath did not sound like the one beneath them. The one below was steadier, deeper, alive, and it was calling her name. When the autumn rains came, they turned the Mississippi to a mirror of mud. The fields around Belle filled with stagnant water, and the air thickened with the smell of wet soil and rot. It was the season Elias Beaumont called profitable weather, for it meant the riverboats slowed and his buyers lingered longer in Natchez, willing to pay more for his human stock. He held his auctions in the carriage yard behind the house. The veranda became his pulpit, and from there he would call down bids like a preacher reciting psalms. The slaves were lined in neat, terrible rows, bodies trembling in the damp heat, eyes fixed on the dirt. He dressed them well for the spectacle. Clean cloth, oiled skin, shined teeth. His cruelty always wore its Sunday best. Eveline watched from her balcony that morning, dressed in white as if for mourning. The rain fell soft, unending, turning the earth into red sludge. Her parasol drooped with the weight of water. She had never stood so close to the cruelty before, not when Elias was conducting his trade. She had told herself she wanted to witness it once, to understand what her life was built upon. But as the men were paraded one by one, her throat closed around the truth of it. They were not numbers, not chattel, not property. They were living things whose humanity had been buried under the weight of someone else's profit, and she was part of that someone. Her gaze found him again among them. Samuel, shirt torn, wrists bound, his shoulders gleaming with rain. The water ran down his face like sweat, but he did not flinch. He did not lower his head. Elias raised his voice over the murmur of the crowd. The words rolled like thunder. Strong back, no defects, knows the cane and the field. The buyers nodded, some with hunger in their eyes. Eveline could not breathe. She could see the line of Samuel's jaw, the pulse in his throat, the dark stillness in his gaze. When the first bid rose, she felt a sound leave her mouth before she even knew it. A small, sharp gasp. Enough to draw Elias's glance upward. He saw her on the balcony, and a strange smile passed across his face. To him it must have looked like approval, perhaps admiration. He nodded, proud, before returning to his business. She backed away from the railing and sank into the chair behind her. Her hands trembled. She pressed them against her chest and felt her heart hammering like a trapped bird. It was that moment, that awful, helpless moment, when she realized what she was capable of feeling. It was not pity. Not entirely. There was something else in it, something shameful, something alive. That night, after the auction, the sound of laughter drifted up from the parlor. The men drank their brandy, congratulated one another, and spoke of profits and purchases. Eveline sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her own face seemed foreign to her. The lamplight made her skin appear translucent, almost hollow. She wondered how many lives her silence had bought. The rain had stopped, but the earth still whispered. Beneath the house, the hidden river moved again, slow and low. Its murmur seemed louder after each sail, as though it drank what Elias spilled. That night she dreamt again. She was standing on the riverbank, barefoot, her white gown clinging to her like a second skin. The water shone black beneath the moon. In it she saw her reflection, but not her face. Samuel's. His eyes stared back through the rippling dark, and when she reached toward him, her hand passed through water that burned like fever. She woke, gasping, the sheets damp, the scent of rain still in the air. The next morning she told the housemaid to fetch water from the well rather than the kitchen pump. She said she wanted it cool, untouched. But when the maid returned, Eveline noticed her hesitance, the way her eyes darted, the way her mouth trembled before speaking. The maid said she had seen someone at the edge of the fields near the old storm drain. A man, standing in the mist, looking toward the house. Eveline felt the room tilt. She said nothing. That night she went to her husband's study under the pretense of offering tea. Elias was drunk and triumphant, his ledger open before him like a priest's Bible. When she set the tray down, she saw the names written inside, columns of them, listed like inventory. Samuel's among them, circled in ink. She read the notation beside it, to be sent upriver. Sale pending Memphis. Her heart struck against her ribs. She waited until Elias passed out in his chair before taking the key from his vest pocket. The next morning she went down to the storage, pens behind the smokehouse, the holding place for those awaiting transport. It was still early, the air thick with fog. She carried a shawl around her shoulders and a basket of bread and fruit, an act of charity too small to raise suspicion. The overseer greeted her stiffly but did not stop her. No one ever did. She was the master's wife, and her sadness made her untouchable. Inside the pen, the smell of straw, sweat, and iron filled the air. She saw them again, all five from the original group, thinner now, their eyes dull from waiting. But when her gaze found Samuel, it was like the first breath after drowning. He looked at her once without expression. She wanted to speak but could not. The silence between them was unbearable, full of everything forbidden to be said aloud. She placed the basket down and turned to leave. But before she reached the door, his voice came quietly from behind her. "You shouldn't come here." The sound of it made her knees weaken. She did not turn. She only said, "They are sending you away." He was silent for a long time before answering. "We all get sent somewhere." When she did finally look back, their eyes met again. And in that instant, something changed between them. It was no longer charity or curiosity or guilt. It was recognition, of pain, of longing, of the cruel symmetry between power and helplessness. She wanted to say something that might save him, but no language in her world had words for mercy. That night, the house seemed to breathe heavier. The river beneath the floor sounded like it was rising. Eveline could hear it even while awake. The pulse of water against soil, steady as a heartbeat, echoing in the quiet chambers of Vale. The following morning, Elias announced he would travel north within a fortnight to oversee the next auction. He told Eveline she would accompany him, that she needed refinement by travel, as if her sorrow were a disease cured by distance. She nodded, wordless. That afternoon she watched from her window as Samuel and the others were loaded into a wagon. The wheels sank into the mud, the chains clanked like dull bells. When the wagon began to roll toward the road, Samuel turned once and looked back. Their eyes met through the haze of rain, and then he was gone. For the next 3 days, the whisper beneath the house fell silent. On the 4th, the storm began, and a violent, howling thing that tore branches from trees and shook the shutters through the night. Eveline stayed awake through it all, waiting for the sound of water again. When it finally came, it was not beneath her floorboards but on her doorstep. The Mississippi itself, swollen and furious, spilling its banks. By dawn, half the road had vanished into the flood. The wagon that carried Samuel north never made it past the bridge. When the news came back, Elias cursed the loss of his investment. Eveline said nothing. But that night, when she went down to the cellar again, she found the cracks in the old brick wall had widened. The mortar had bled away, leaving open veins through which the river had begun to seep. And there, in the flicker of her lantern, she saw the outline of a handprint pressed into the wet stone. Large, fresh, the whisper of the buried current sounded almost like breath. She knelt and pressed her own palm against it, feeling the warmth beneath the damp, and when she did, she thought she felt the faint pulse of another heart. Beating from the other side of the wall, autumn rotted slowly into winter. The air in Mississippi grew colder, but inside Vale the heat refused to leave. The house trapped it like breath inside a coffin. Eveline could not bear the fire in the hearth, nor the touch of blankets. She walked barefoot through the halls at night, her white gown soaked in sweat, her hair unbound, her eyes fixed on the walls as if she could see the heartbeat behind them. Something was changing within her. She could not name it, only feel it. A slow fever that coiled through her veins and filled her mind with the scent of wet earth and iron. When she closed her eyes, she could still see him, Samuel, his face half in shadow, the quiet defiance in his eyes. She saw him every night now, behind her eyelids, in the rippling of water, in the shape of her own reflection in the mirror. Elias noticed her strangeness only in passing. He complained that she had gone pale and withdrawn, that she slept too much and ate too little, that she left her embroidery to rot and her correspondence unanswered. But he never asked why. His attention was fixed on his failing business. The storm that had destroyed the bridge had also ruined several plantations along the river, leaving him short on buyers and deep in debt. He spent his days locked in his study, cursing figures and names, writing letters no one would answer. At night, he drank until he slept, leaving Eveline alone to wander the house with her fever and her ghosts. The servants had begun to fear her. They said she walked like a dreamer and whispered to walls that listened. They crossed themselves when she passed. She began to keep a small diary, nothing of words, only symbols. A circle for the river, a hand for the touch she imagined, a single mark that resembled both a heart and a wound. She hid it beneath her pillow and wrote in it each night after the house fell silent. The sound beneath the floor had grown stronger. It was no longer the faint murmur of buried water, but something heavier, like breathing. Sometimes, lying still, she could feel the floorboards rise and fall beneath her as though the house itself inhaled. The cellar called to her more often now. She would take the lantern and go down barefoot, the cold of the stone biting at her feet. The smell of damp earth filled the air, and the sound of the hidden current throbbed against the walls. She could see where the river had begun to eat its way through the bricks, leaving dark stains that spread like veins. Each time she went, she found new handprints in the wet clay, some half-formed, others deep and perfect as though pressed by flesh. Once she saw the faint outline of a bare footprint beside her own. She never screamed. Instead, she began to speak softly into the darkness. Not words of prayer, but confessions, whispered apologies, secrets she had never dared to tell anyone. She told the darkness about the stillborn child she buried behind the orchard, the one Elias refused to mourn. She told it about her dreams of water, of hands beneath the surface. And sometimes when she paused, she thought she heard an answer. A single exhale, a sound like breath touching her ear. It did not frighten her anymore. It calmed her. The fever came in waves after that. Long, delirious nights when she lay half-conscious, her body trembling with heat, her mind drifting between waking and dream. In those hours she saw him clearly, not as a ghost, but as he had been, standing in the rain, his skin slick with light, his eyes fixed on hers. He would reach for her and she for him, and always before their hands met, she would wake. Each time she woke, she found her sheets damp, the sound of water whispering beneath the bed. The house began to decay in small, secret ways. The plaster bubbled in the corners, the walls sweated through the paint. In the upstairs hallway, one of the portraits, her husband's mother, began to weep, a slow, steady trickle of moisture from the frame, leaving a stain down the wallpaper like tears. Elias blamed the weather. The servants blamed her. Eveline began to sense something else, not supernatural but inevitable. The house, she thought, was remembering what it had been built over. The sins it had buried were coming loose in the floodwater beneath its foundations. On the coldest night of November, she woke to find her window open, the curtains breathing like lungs. The air smelled of river water, damp, metallic. When she rose, she saw a trail of wet footprints leading from the door to the bed. Her hands trembled as she followed them. They stopped at the foot of the bed, then turned back toward the door, vanishing into the hall. She stepped into the corridor, the candle shaking in her grip. The house was utterly silent except for that faint pulse of water beneath everything, beneath the wood, beneath her skin. She walked to the staircase. At the bottom, the front door stood ajar. Outside, the mist hung thick over the fields, glowing pale in the moonlight. And there, by the old cypress at the edge of the property, she saw him, Samuel, standing in the fog, bare to the waist, his body half lost to shadow. He looked neither dead nor living, but some impossible thing between. She could not move. The candle sputtered, its flame bending toward him. He raised a hand, not beckoning, not warning, simply offering, and then he was gone. The fog swallowed him whole. The next morning she was found asleep on the steps, her gown soaked through, her hands streaked with mud. She remembered nothing of how she had gotten there. Elias said nothing at first. But later that evening, when he found the damp footprints still marked on the foyer floor, he struck her across the face for the first time. It did not hurt as much as she expected. It felt, in a terrible way, deserved. That night she went down to the cellar again, her cheek still burning, her hair unbound. She brought no lantern this time. The dark felt almost kind. She knelt before the old brick wall and pressed her hand to the damp surface. It was warm again, and beating. A sound rose through it, so faint she could barely hear it, like a voice submerged in water. And though she could not make out the words, she thought she heard her name. The fever broke soon after, or perhaps it consumed her entirely. She no longer slept in her bed, but on the floor, where she could feel the pulse of the buried river through the boards. She stopped eating. She began to hum to herself, the same melody she had once used to lull her child that never lived. The servants said they saw her walking outside at night, her nightdress trailing through the wet grass, her hands lifted as if feeling the air for something invisible. One of them swore they saw her at the edge of the flooded ditch, kneeling and speaking softly to the water as if to a lover. By December, Vale had begun to sink. Cracks ran through the plaster like veins. The cellar flooded completely, swallowing the lower walls. The sound of water beneath the house became constant, no longer a whisper but a pulse steady and endless, like a second heart beating beneath the earth. Eveline spent her days in the parlor, staring into the empty fireplace. The air smelled of mold and sickness. Elias raged at the collapsing foundations, at the ruined crops, at the uselessness of prayers. He did not notice that his wife had begun to disappear before his eyes. When he finally did, it was already too late. The fever in the walls had spread to her, or perhaps she had always been its source. She no longer spoke of Samuel aloud. But sometimes in her delirium she murmured to the floor. Her words were fragments: water, mercy, forgive, like pieces of a psalm she only half remembered. And when she pressed her ear to the boards, she swore she could hear a heartbeat answering her. The rains came in late September, flooding the fields until the world seemed made of mirrors. The sky bled into the river into the soil, and the soil into the graves behind the house. For days, Eleanor watched the land dissolve, watched the fences vanish under the slow surge of brown water, watched the magnolia blossoms rot and fall in heaps around the veranda. Every hour the wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of wet iron, the odor of rust, of rain-soaked chains, of old blood coaxed up from the ground. Inside, the house had begun to rot from within. The plaster walls swelled with moisture, the portraits ran like tears, and the sound of dripping water came from places where no leak could be found. At night, she could hear it beneath the floorboards, a slow tapping, like the pulse of something trying to climb upward through the boards, through the rugs, through her. She had once filled the rooms with laughter, the piano, the dances, the candlelit suppers where her husband's guests boasted of shipments and profits, where their cigars burned holes in the lace. But now the house was silent, emptied of servants, emptied of guests, emptied of God. Only the rain remained, and her memory of those she had watched led away in chains, their eyes glancing up toward her window as they were herded onto wagons bound for the river. There was one she could not forget. His name had been Samuel, a name spoken only once in her presence, yet it had lingered like perfume. She had seen him only in fragments, his wrists bound, his shoulders marked, his gaze unbroken. She had told herself it was pity, that the way her breath trembled when he looked at her was something holy, a mercy born of her woman's heart. But she knew it was not mercy that burned within her. It was hunger. The day Thomas sold him, the sky had turned black with starlings. They lifted from the trees in such number that they blotted out the sun, their wings rattling like bones. She remembered standing at the parlor window, her hands trembling on the frame as Samuel was led down toward the wagons. He did not look back at her. He did not need to. Something passed between them that defied words. Something that split her in half, wife and sinner, mistress and slave to her own heart. Now, months later, as the floodwaters rose, she dreamed of him nightly. Not as he had been, but as she imagined him now. Eyes open beneath the current, mouth full of silt, body unbroken though the world had tried to destroy him. She dreamed that he called to her from beneath the river, that the water beneath the house was thick with his voice, murmuring her name in the dark. One evening, when the storm was at its loudest, Eleanor descended into the cellar. She carried only a candle and the memory of that name. The air was thick with mildew, with the sourness of wet earth. The river had risen into the lower walls, and a thin sheet of water lapped at her boots. Somewhere deeper in the dark, she heard it, the slow rhythm of that underground current. It was not madness that led her forward. It was longing, the belief that love could transcend even the chains she had permitted, that it could reach through earth and water and silence. She followed the sound to where the foundation met the river rock, where the wall was slick with seepage. And there, between the bricks, the candlelight caught movement, the faint shimmer of something buried but not still. She fell to her knees, pressed her ear to the damp stone, heard the faintest exhale, not the wind, not the river, but a breath, Samuel's voice, or the memory of it, whispering that she was not forgiven. The candle guttered. The flame stretched thin, then vanished. She did not move. Even when the cold crept into her bones, even when the dark began to hum with the pulse of the house itself, she stayed. She whispered to the silence, begged it to answer her, and in the hollow that followed, something answered. Not in words, but in feeling. A surge of warmth behind her eyes, a trembling in her chest, as though her own heart had shifted to a rhythm not her own. When she rose again, her dress was soaked through. The candle had fallen into the water, extinguished. She climbed the stairs with her hands trailing along the wall, fingers brushing against veins of moisture that pulsed faintly beneath the plaster. It felt alive, as though the house itself had become a living thing, its blood running with the same current she had heard below. That night she did not sleep. She sat by the window until dawn, her reflection warped by the rain, her eyes fixed on the river beyond the fields. When the first light broke, it shone upon the water like glass. And for one fragile instant, she saw his face there, serene beneath the surface. Not drowned, not gone, waiting. She pressed her hand against the window, whispering his name again and again, until it no longer sounded like a word, but a prayer. And from somewhere deep within the house, a sound answered. A single drop, then another, then the slow, steady rhythm of dripping, like footsteps coming up from the cellar. By dusk, the sound filled the halls. Every wall seemed to breathe, every floorboard to tremble. The portraits had begun to peel away from their canvases, the varnish blistering in the humidity. The piano, untouched for months, gave one solitary note, faint, uncertain, as though struck by an unseen hand. Eleanor stood at the center of the parlor, the air thick with damp heat and the smell of decay. Her hair clung to her neck, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. She whispered to the emptiness, her voice breaking, "You are here." The wind rose, shaking the shutters. A picture fell, glass shattering across the rug. Beneath her bare feet, the floorboards bowed. And in that moment, as the storm thundered over the land, she knew that the river beneath the house had found her. Not as vengeance, not as haunting, but as an embrace, the terrible sacred union she had prayed for. And as she closed her eyes, she imagined herself sinking, her body slipping through the boards, through the foundation, into the cool current that wound its way through the dark earth. She imagined Samuel waiting there, his arms outstretched, his eyes open, the river wrapping around them both. But when she opened her eyes, she was still standing. The house silent, the rain spent. Only the faintest pulse remained, deep beneath her feet, steady and patient as a heartbeat. She realized then what the river had come to take. Not her body, not her soul, but the house itself, the monument to every cruelty, every sale, every silence. And as the first crack split the parlor floor, and the boards groaned like breaking bones, Eleanor Devereux began to laugh, a sound that echoed through the empty halls, wild and holy and full of ruin. The morning after the storm broke, the world seemed newly made. The river had swollen beyond its banks, swallowing the road, the cotton fields, and the graveyard that lay behind the Devereux house. Everything that had once been divided by fence or stone was now one vast sheet of moving water, a gray mirror without sky. The only sound was the low groan of wood as the house settled, or resisted, against the rising flood. Eleanor woke on the parlor floor, her dress still damp from the night before, her hands smeared with mud. She did not remember falling asleep. The candles had burned down to pools of wax. The room smelled faintly of smoke and rain. The floor beneath her was cold, and when she pressed her ear to it, she heard it again, the river's pulse, closer than ever. For a long moment she lay there listening, her heart beating in time with the sound beneath. Then she rose. The house was empty, or rather it had become a hollow through which the river moved. The furniture had shifted slightly in the night, the drapes hung limp and stained, and in the grand hallway the portrait of her husband had come loose, hanging askew as if in shame. His painted eyes, once cold and commanding, seemed almost to plead now, as if the storm had rinsed them of arrogance. Eleanor walked barefoot across the warped boards, the hem of her dress whispering in the silence. Every step felt guided, as if the current beneath the house had already chosen her path. She did not weep, nor did she pray. There was no longer any need for confession. She had lived within sin so long, it had become the air she breathed. In the mirror by the stairwell, her reflection startled her. The woman who stared back looked almost unrecognizable, hair silvered by sleeplessness, face thin as paper, eyes too large, too bright. She realized with a kind of cold clarity that she had begun to look like her own ghost. The air inside the house felt feverish. The scent of magnolia had turned cloying, sweet as rot. She could hear the river whispering her name through the walls, not in words but in rhythm. Each drip of water that fell from the ceiling matched the cadence of her breath. Each gust of wind seemed to call her downward, to the place beneath the floor where the river waited. She followed the sound. The door to the cellar was half open, the darkness below alive with the glimmer of water. She took a candle from the table and stepped down slowly, her fingers tracing the slick handrail. The further she descended, the cooler the air became, until it felt almost tender. The breath of something vast and patient. At the base of the stairs, the river had already claimed the floor. Water reached her ankles, then her calves, warm and silty. The reflection of the candle trembled on its surface like a small, frightened soul. She remembered every man who had been sold beneath this roof. Every hand that had been forced into chains, every eye that had met hers with quiet disbelief. She had smiled then, believing her softness absolved her. She had told herself she was powerless, the property of her husband, the product of her time. But she knew now that her silence had been its own form of cruelty. She had watched the river of suffering flow past her and called it distance. Now that same river had come for her. Eleanor waded deeper. The candle's flame bent low, its light turning the cellar walls to gold for a moment before dimming again. Her breath came slow and even. She no longer feared drowning. She feared only waking from this strange calm before the end. When the water reached her waist, she stopped. The stones beneath her feet shifted slightly, not unstable, but alive. The river was moving through them, whispering, drawing her closer. She closed her eyes. Behind them, she saw Samuel again, not as he had been, but as she had dreamed him. Standing beneath the surface, light pouring through the current, his face serene. In that image there was no accusation, only stillness, as if he had accepted something long before she ever could. She whispered his name. The sound trembled from her lips, too soft to echo, and yet the river heard. The candle flickered once, then went out. In the darkness, she felt the water rise to her chest, her throat, her mouth. It tasted of earth and iron and memory. She tilted her head back, opened her eyes, and saw through the thin veil of light above her, the faint shimmer of morning filtering through the cracks in the floorboards. It was beautiful. The color of pewter, the color of forgiveness. Then, from the depths below, she felt it. A hand, or the memory of one, brushing against her arm. She did not pull away. She let herself sink. The current embraced her gently, pulling her down through the cold weight of the water. Her dress billowed around her like the ghost of a wedding veil. The deeper she sank, the quieter the world became, until there was no sound at all, but her own heartbeat fading into the rivers. For a moment, she thought she heard voices, not cruel, not vengeful, but sorrowful. The chorus of those she had once condemned to silence. Their words were not of blame, but of remembrance. Each syllable a name, each name a weight lifted, and then silence. Above her, the house began to break. The foundation, softened by months of rain, gave way at last. The parlor floor collapsed inward, timbers splintering like ribs. The portraits fell, the glass shattered, and the white columns that had once stood as monuments to pride sank slowly into the water. By dusk, the Devereux plantation was gone. Only the upper roof remained visible, its shingles gleaming faintly beneath the setting sun before being swallowed whole. The magnolia trees, stripped of their blooms, stood like mourners at the water's edge. For weeks afterward, travelers along the Natchez Trace spoke of the flood that had taken the Devereux estate. They said the house had sunk without a sound, that the river had been eerily calm that day, as though satisfied. Some claimed that when the moon was high, a woman's voice could still be heard singing from beneath the surface. Not in grief, but in devotion, they called it the River Bride's Lament. But those who knew the truth, the few who had seen what that place had been, said nothing. For they understood what the river had done. It had not punished. It had remembered. And somewhere beneath the silt and stone, Eleanor Devereux lay entwined with the current, her body long gone, her name washed away. But her voice still carried on the slow, eternal tide. It was not love that had saved her. It was reckoning, and the river, vast, patient, merciless, kept her forever.